Okay, everyone, this is lecture 8.1. This time we will be talking about white-collar crime. So, in this lecture, we will talk about basic definitions of what is white-collar crime exactly. We'll talk about regulating white-collar crime. We'll talk about deregulating white-collar crime. And then we'll talk about how we've tried to fix our current problems surrounding white-collar crime in the modern era. So first, let's have some basic definitions, because that's always a good place to start. Most of what we call crime is actually blue-collar crime. So some common examples of blue-collar crime are robbery, mugging, stealing a car. Typically, we define blue-collar crime as ways of breaking the law that make money, right? And we understand these blue-collar crimes because we've been taught our whole lives that they're wrong. It says in our religious texts, don't steal, don't hurt people in a way if you need to make money, right? But specifically, thou shalt not steal, right? We understand these crimes. Our grandparents teach us that these breaking of the laws are illegal. Our parents teach us that these specific things are illegal. But some crime is what can be called white-collar crime. These crimes are crimes that are committed also to make money, but they're committed with access to, and that should be T-O, not T-O-O, access to and or knowledge of business, right? So you need a certain knowledge of business. You need a certain access to business. And thus, you're not going to get that kind of access and that kind of knowledge unless you are middle class or upper middle class, right? So white-collar crime is the crime of people with privilege already. So examples of white-collar crimes are things like Ponzi schemes, things like embezzling, things like pyramid schemes. And you may have some knowledge of how that kind of thing goes, but you don't really have a formal working knowledge of how these things go. That's the difference. That's the difference why we think blue-collar criminal, absolutely guilty. Guy that robs a bank, guy that robs a gas station. Someone who does a Ponzi scheme, though, we might say to ourselves, is that actually a crime? We just have a typically less understanding of these crimes. White-collar criminals are almost always not treated as harshly as blue-collar criminals, and just re-emphasizing a little bit of what I did in the previous slide, these crimes aren't seen as being as dangerous, right? So take, for example, a blue-collar crime, breaking into someone's house. We see that as being really dangerous, a major violation of your privacy. And when your house is broken into, realistically, if you think about it, you might have to buy a new TV, you might have to buy a new computer, and you might have to repair the damages. Estimating on the high end, that might be $1,000, maybe $2,000 out of your pocket. And that's bad. That sucks. It's terrible. But if someone embezzles millions of dollars, including the funds that are going to be your retirement fund, as they would in white-collar crime, your quality of life will suffer significantly for the last 20 years of your life, right? So if someone steals your retirement fund via embezzling, I mean, that could not only make your quality of life worse, that could take years off the end of your life by not having those resources. The 2008 economic downturn was caused largely by the collective action of white-collar criminals. So in this way, this handful of bad players in the mid-2000s, they caused our entire economy, which impacts all of us, impacts the jobs your parents have, and impacts the jobs I have, and the jobs that you hopefully will have getting out of school, and your capability of getting a job. All of that was hurt by what these reputable business people did to all of us, and that's big, bad, terrible crime. It's more than just that we don't see these crimes as dangerous. It's also that we don't see we see white collar criminals as respectable, right? So these people can afford lawyers, but we see them differently. Why? Because they have cultural capital, right? They have the knowledges and the habits associated with growing up in a certain socioeconomic class. How do we put that another way? We see them as being respectable. One example, if someone exhibits upper class cultural capital, they're more likely to look impressive, look respectable, wear a fancy suit. If someone exhibits lower socioeconomic cultural capital, they're more likely to be seen as dangerous, right? If someone is wearing baggy pants and a sports jersey, we might be more likely to see that person as being a criminal as opposed to if this person is wearing a suit. And here is my example of that. When a white collar criminal shows up in court with a $4,000 suit and 2 lawyers, we see that person as a respectable business person. This is Bernie Madoff, one of the most notorious white collar criminals of the first decade of the 2000s. This guy looks respectable, right? But when a blue collar criminal shows up wearing a sports jersey and blue jeans in court, this guy looks like a scumbag. This guy looks like the worst criminal compared to this guy, even though this dude, I believe what he did was shoplift some things from a convenience store. So maybe got away with $30, while this guy got away with billions of dollars. And yeah, who's the worst criminal? So now let's talk about how we once regulated white collar crime, because these laws have changed dramatically over the last 100 years. So originally we regulated industry because industry was acting very, very bad during the 1800s. They often acted without respect for human life or for the law. Employers often avoided even the most basic safety standards in pursuit of profit. And we see an example of this in one of the most notorious cases of treating workers very badly, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And this is a very grisly event that if you wanted to dive into and see just how horrible it was, it's relatively easy to do it, but I'm going to go into just the basics. 146 workers died due to fire, smoke inhalation, or jumping to their deaths out of this building, the Triangle Shirtwaist Building. The reason why so many people died is that the emergency exits in these long rows of people all jammed together, the exits where it says fire escape right here, they were locked shut. They were locked shut because the employers were afraid that the employees were going to steal tiny pieces of cloth from them, right? A trivial amount of money. Additionally, there was some emergency equipment, but it was so out of date and so poorly maintained that those fire hoses that were present to try to put things out inside the building, they were completely ineffective. They were broken. They didn't work. So this tragedy specifically, where 146 workers died, where many workers jumped to their deaths out of the building, this tragedy led to increased regulations in what was considered workplace safety. It led to eventually the development of the Occupation Safety Standards Organization, OSHA. You know it as. I really should know what that stands for specifically. I have a cousin that works for OSHA. Additionally, increased union organizing. Unions came into place around this time largely because of how badly employers were treating their workers. Additionally, around the year 1907, we developed the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA continues and is dedicated to maintaining food and safety standards in the United States. The reason why the FDA came into being at around this time were from, again, a number of cases of white-collar crime, incidents where companies were trying to make money in pursuit of trying to make profits off the back of innocent people. If you read the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, it lays out the meatpacking plants in Chicago and the malpractices there, and these were actually real incidents that spurned on the FDA. Effectively, what the meatpacking industry was doing was putting sawdust and other waste products from the slaughter process back into sausages and into other meats. Now, if you know anything about sausage making, you'll know that you put like the not as good meat in there, but what they were doing was putting like literal garbage in sausages in order to sell more sausages and get rid of the garbage. That clearly is like unacceptable practice. Additionally, what really got the FDA going was the use of phthalimide and this drug called RUR426, which were sweetening agents that pharmaceutical companies were putting into medicines to make children be able to take the medicine. So those sweetening agents wound up actually being deadly. Like they were poisonous sweetening agents, and we were giving these things to children. And companies were either not testing it, or they knew very well that it could be poison, and they were selling this to give to children. That's what made the FDA. That's what put regulations into place to stop businesses from being this unethical. In 1948, the Federal Trade Commission came into being. The FTC is dedicated to maintaining equitable standards of trade in the open market. So the FTC includes breaking up monopolies, making sure trade is actually fair in our economy, which isn't something we emphasize as much anymore. We talk more about businesses being able to do business as opposed to businesses operating fair and legally. The Securities and Exchange Commission, additionally, was put into place and being responsible for protecting investors and maintaining fair functions of security markets and facilitating investment. So the SEC is especially interested in these kinds of crimes that sound like, is that really against the law? But in reality is majorly, it's a big problem to our economy when these kinds of white-collar crimes are committed. So things like insider trading, things like Ponzi schemes, and other unfair business practices that do need to be enforced just as much as blue-collar crimes do need to be enforced. So we have all these, over the course of the 20th century, up until the 1980s, we consistently were putting laws into place to keep white-collar crime from happening, to regulate what businesses can do and what businesses can't do, just like we regulate what individual people can do and can't do. Then a political push started to start deregulating white-collar crime. So many of the regulations that were put into place between the era of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and the 1980s aren't in place anymore. These regulations were removed during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and they were taken out of place. They were taken out because it was politically advantageous. It's not that all regulations went away. There are still many regulations, right? So as it is now, another Triangle Shirtwaist Fire could not happen the way that happened. Something else terrible could happen, but specifically it couldn't be quite like that. But there are many regulations that were taken out that may still be needed, but were taken out because they were politically advantageous. So specifically, this trend was called deregulation. It was and continues to be a trend among conservative politicians to diminish or eliminate laws that are intended to regulate business. People that think deregulation is a good thing says it helps businesses be more competitive, which it undeniably, if you're allowed to put sawdust in sausages, you can make more money off your sausages. But opponents of deregulation say that these regulations help protect customers, help protect the general public, help keep us from being poisoned by the medicines that we're giving our children. Notable instances of white-collar crime that were made possible by deregulation include the following. So these are things that are very bad, but only slightly criminal, but could have been maybe prevented if we had stronger regulation. Enron is a notorious accounting fraud institution. They were a privatized investment bank. Enron committed systematic accounting fraud. Bear Stearns is another firm that sold billions of dollars of investments to people. And those investments were next to worthless, right? So they were selling a product to people that was worth almost nothing. And they were promising that they would get heavy dividends from those, right? So if I was doing the same thing, selling cheeseburgers to people, but as it turned out, the hamburger was actually made out of dirt, I would be taken in for fraud. But the way Bear Stearns did it, they were so sophisticated at it that they almost got away with it. They were held accountable, but they caused massive amounts of damage to our economy. AIG was an accounting firm that committed accounting fraud and produced fraudulent reports to investors. So what they were doing is effectively they were doing what's called cooking the books. They had these reports, financial reports that they're required to give investors, and they simply were lying about how much money they were making. And that is against the law, and that is also something that's very damaging to economies and investment. Lehman Brothers were heavy players in the subprime there's a lot of words up here I'm not used to saying. Why? Because we don't talk about white collar crime. Lehman Brothers was heavily involved in the subprime mortgage crisis, which involved short selling of investments, malfeasance. And what is malfeasance? Is deceiving accounting practices that would encourage people to buy your thing, even if that thing isn't actually worth it. All of these, so look back at here a second, Lehman Brothers, AIG, Bear Stearns, Enron, all of these led to an incident known as the Great Economic Meltdown of 2008. This is an incident in which white-collar crime effectively gutted our economy. There's a reason why people that can't get work. There's a reason why your student loan debt is going to be so tremendous. There's a reason why there are a lot of things suffering in our economy. It's the Great Economic Meltdown of 2008. This was a barrage of foreclosures, so banks taking back property, which was fueled by sales tactics that resulted in the crisis itself. So effectively what was happening was that banks were loaning money to people who were at high risk of not being able to pay back their investments. I'm sure you could probably find on YouTube clips of, there were commercials, like every single commercial break, there were commercials encouraging people, hey, you don't think you can afford a home? You totally can afford a home. Go ahead and call us. And these places were giving loans to people that actually shouldn't have been given loans. And when that occurred, many people couldn't actually pay back those loans. Well, when you can't pay back a loan, the bank has to come and repossess your house. And when this happened, when the banks repossessed houses, they then unloaded these what were called high risk obligations to investment firms. So investment firms, and I know this is supposed to be confusing, right? That's how they made all this money and destroyed our economy. Investment firms would then buy these masses of houses that were worth next to nothing, and then they would put them all in what they were calling complex derivatives and selling them back to investors, selling them back to people, that naive investors who maybe weren't great at knowing what to invest in, right? So they were effectively screwing the American people twice. They were selling people houses they couldn't afford, and then people will get screwed over by not being able to pay back those loans. And then they would then sell another group of people in these investments, and they thought, oh, I'm so smart. Well, in reality, those investments were also next to worthless. And I know this is all intensely confusing. There is a really amazing audio recording. It's podcast. It's also actual radio show. It's been released in a number of ways. It's by This American Life. It's called The Giant Pool of Money. If you want to copy and paste or just put in that incredibly long web address, you can get linked to it's at least an hour. It's a really long and very detailed explanation of how the economic meltdown actually happened. It was just an amazing explanation of what I just jammed into the slide. If you want to know more about that very ugly moment in our recent history, right? That's less than 15 years ago. That basically screwed all of us. So when this happened, the economic meltdown, what have we done to try to fix that, to make things work again? Well, first of all, in 2008, we put into place what was called the DoddFrank Act. This established some added restraints on businesses, largely in response to the 2018 economic downturn. So it specified that large companies must report the ratio between the compensation of their CEOs and the median earnings of their employees. So there has to be, according to the Dodd-Frank Act, some oversight as to how much the CEOs are making compared to the average worker. So we see this when we look at these trends. Up until 95, it was in 1995, the average worker, so like your average office worker, maybe mid-level accountant, is making 100 times less than the average worker, right? And that sounds like a lot. But in 2000, was when it hit its peak, that is about 370 times. They were making 370 times as much as the average worker. And people did become aware of this over the course of the 2000s. And this did go down slightly, and then the spikes down. This is the 2008 economic downturn, right? So this says to me, when I read it, that those companies that were the very worst at that, those companies were the ones that went out of business in the economic downturn. So that may be a positive there, even though so many other people lost a lot of money. That lowest trough was about in probably 2009, when just all of those plummeted, and it came back up to about 300 times. And this is about when Dodd-Frank was put into place. Dodd-Frank was put into place, so hypothetically, if it weren't for that act, it could have kept going back up, but now it is going down again. At this moment, it's about 271 times, which is probably not what we think is really a fair pay ratio. We don't think that the top boss should probably make almost 300 times as much as the average employee, but Dodd-Frank does help kind of even that out some, just by making them. It doesn't say that this, for example, does not say that the average CEO can't be paid 1,000 times as much as the average employee. All Dodd-Frank says is that that companies have to be accountable, and they have to say that they're doing that. And if they say that they're doing that, that means that it's public knowledge, and maybe it isn't really super politically popular for a CEO to make that much money, so that regulates them. Additionally, if you've been doing banking for more than the last 5 years or so, maybe 10 years, if you're a little bit older, like I am, you will remember a time when every time you made a little mistake in your banking and you accidentally over withdrew, it was once very, very easy to get tagged with a $30 penalty for pulling more money out of the bank than you actually have in the bank. That used to be so common. And then that's a double insult because you don't have any money and then they charge you $30 for not having any money, right? This effectively hit poor people real hard. Now, when you try to pull more money out of the bank than you actually have, they just say, hey, you can't pay for that. That's what the bank does now. And the reason why the bank just says, hey, you can't pay for that, that's part of the DoddFrank Act too, is there was a cap put on fees for getting to use debit cards and for charging those overdraft fees. There's a reason that miraculously changed one day. It was the DoddFrank Act. Additionally, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, also known as the Public Company Reform and Investor Protection Act, requires CEOs and CFOs to attest to the fact that their financial reports are accurate. This goes back to some of those big players prior to the 2008 downturn who were lying about their financial records. And if it's found that those financial records are incorrect, the CEOs and the CFOs can be made to reimburse the company for any equity-based compensation they receive and for any profit that they obtain from the sales of the company's stock. Thus, if a CEO today, thanks to Sarbanes-Oxley, if they lie about the money that the company is making, if they embezzle some of that money, or if they're just, trying to cover their butts, or just plain incompetent, they can be required to give back the money that they made, right? They are not necessarily required to pay back the money that they're lying about, but they can be forced to pay back some of the profit they made from the company, which, that's something. It's not, it won't necessarily fix everything, but it's something we're trying to do to fix it. This is certainly an area, white collar crime, where a lot of people get away with a lot of things that they really shouldn't. But we have attempted since 2008 to try to fix some of it. Do we have a long way to go in fixing all these problems? Of course we do, but it's a low grade bright streak in a really, really ugly dark cloud. Okay, that is it for this lecture. As with always, if you have any questions, if there's any issues happening in the class, please let me know, and I will do my best to fix those. Thanks.